Oral questions, questions orales. Honorable Leader of the Chambre.
Monsieur le Président, la promesse électorale des libéraux était de maintenir le déficit à 10 milliards de dollars. Malheureusement, pour les contribuables, ils ont déjà manqué à cette promesse. Le Premier ministre ne peut pas continuer à blâmer aux autres. C'est lui qui contrôle les dépenses maintenant. Alors, quel est son nouveau chiffre? 20, 30, 40 milliards? À combien son déficit va s'élever?
Premier ministre.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nous avons été très clairs dès le début que nous allons toujours être ouverts et transparents avec les Canadiens par rapport à l'état des finances et par rapport à nos projections. Ce que nous avons toujours dit, c'est qu'il y avait 2 points d'ancrage. D'abord, de continuer à diminuer le ratio dette à PIB et aussi d'assurer qu'on restaure l'équilibre avant 2019. Et c'est ce que nous allons faire. Merci.
Leader of the Opposition.
Province of Alberta, people are worried. With dropping oil prices, tens of thousands of Albertans have lost their jobs. Now, what has been the Prime Minister's response? Nothing. Not a mention to date. If it was the auto sector or the aerospace sector, the Liberals would be scrambling to help. But to the Prime Minister, I guess Albertans are just collateral damage. Why is the Prime Minister turning his back on Albertans in their time of need?
Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the previous government make a big show about being a great friend to Alberta and to the oil industry, but unfortunately, for 10 years, they got nothing done. For 10 years, they weren't able to build the pipeline. They built their entire strategy around hoping that oil prices would remain high, and when they didn't, they were unable to help Alberta. That's why we're working hard to lower taxes for the middle class and to get our resources to market sustainably and environmentally responsibly.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
That'll be cold comfort to people in Alberta that are facing Christmas without a job right now, but we look forward to the green jobs that the Prime Minister will create very shortly. Mr. Speaker, let's remember that the refugees arriving tonight are fleeing from ISIS. Canada made the right decision to send our CF-18s as part of the global fight. The Liberal Party has demonstrated a total failure in leadership by stepping back. Mr. Speaker, if they won't show leadership, this Conservative Party will. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing and vote with us tonight and keep our CF-18s in the fight?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've made clear many times, that Canada continues to be engaged in a robust manner with the coalition, including militarily on top of the great initiatives on humanitarian and refugees. And not only are our allies understanding of that, they are supportive of that. In fact, for the first time in almost 20 years, the White House will be hosting a Canadian Prime Minister for a state dinner. Right. That's the kind of good relationship we're building with our allies.
Honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Monsieur le Président, dimanche dernier, le président Obama faisait référence à ses alliés dans la lutte contre l'État islamique, l'Allemagne, la France, la Grande-Bretagne. Aucune mention du Canada. Dans le discours du trône déposé cette semaine, ce gouvernement parle des États-Unis comme son meilleur ami et partenaire. Encore hier, Monsieur le Président, l'administration Obama faisait appel à ses alliés pour augmenter leur support pour se battre contre l'État islamique. Est-ce digne d'un président du Canada de tourner le dos à son principal ennemi et partenaire en arrêtant les frappes aériennes?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Monsieur le Président, pendant 10 ans, le gouvernement précédent a négligé les relations avec les États-Unis, a cherché la chicane, a été agressif et a insulté les États-Unis à plusieurs reprises. Nous travaillons de façon positive parce qu'on va bâtir une meilleure relation pour des meilleurs emplois ici au Canada. Et d'ailleurs, les États-Unis viennent d'inviter le Premier ministre canadien pour un souper à Washington, ce qui ne s'est jamais fait depuis 19 ans.
Bravo! Honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Monsieur le Président, hier, pour justifier le fait qu'il n'imposerait pas un référendum pour sa réforme démocratique, le premier ministre a fait référence au processus menant au rapatriement unilatéral de la Constitution en 1982. Est-ce que le premier ministre peut expliquer aux Québécois et aux Canadiens pourquoi le rapatriement de 1982 est un bon exemple à suivre de réforme démocratique?
Très honorable Premier ministre.
Je trouve ça extrêmement curieux que ce Parti conservateur est tellement préoccupé par la consultation des Canadiens quand, pour la première fois, c'était la première fois dans l'histoire du pays qu'ils ont mis de l'avant une réforme électorale sans consulter les Canadiens, sans consulter même les partis d'opposition. Vous aviez voulu changer les règles du jeu pour vous avantager. Les Canadiens ont vu à travers ça et ont choisi de ne pas suivre votre façon de faire.
Je rappelle cet honorable Premier ministre qu'il faut s'adresser au président, parce que je pense qu'il sait que je n'ai pas fait ces choses-là. L'honorable député d'Outremont.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson made a stark admission that there are racists in the RCMP. What specifically is the government doing to combat this racism? And will the government make the mandate of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women broad enough to include issues like systemic racism in judicial and police institutions in Canada?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. Obviously, racism in any form is unacceptable and runs contrary to Canada's long history of diversity and inclusion. The Government of Canada is committed to real change and supports decisive action by the RCMP to hold its members accountable as we are beginning the process of an inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. We will, of course, fold in a broad range of stakeholders and questions to ensure that we create justice and accountability in a nation-to-nation relationship moving forward.
The member for Outremont.
Nous saluons l'intention du gouvernement d'instaurer une nouvelle ère dans ses relations avec les peuples autochtones, mais il faut comprendre aussi qu'après des années de déception et de promesses brisées, le gouvernement a une obligation de résultat maintenant. Le premier ministre s'est engagé à mettre fin aux avis d'ébullition d'eau sur toutes les réserves au Canada. Le premier ministre peut-il nous indiquer quand son gouvernement va présenter un plan avec des échéanciers précis pour remplir cette promesse au cours du présent mandat tel que promis?
Bravo.
Très honorable Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, c'est inacceptable que dans un pays comme le Canada, il y a encore tant de communautés qui n'ont pas accès à de l'eau potable. Et le gouvernement du Canada s'est engagé pendant la campagne électorale à s'assurer que d'ici 5 ans, il n'y ait plus de besoin de faire d'ébullition de l'eau dans ces communautés. Nous allons travailler avec ces communautés et nous allons faire les investissements nécessaires pour arrêter ce problème grave.
Honorable député d'Outremont.
Monsieur le Président, une citation. Au niveau de Poste Canada, nous nous engageons à restaurer le service à domicile. Est-ce que le Premier ministre a dit ça, oui ou non?
Très honorable Premier ministre.
Le Parti libéral s'est engagé très clairement à arrêter l'imposition de boîtes postaux par Poste Canada, comme c'était en train d'être fait par le gouvernement précédent, et de travailler avec les citoyens, les contribuables, Poste Canada et les groupes impliqués pour s'assurer que les Canadiens reçoivent les services auxquels ils ont le droit de s'attendre. Merci.
Honorable député d'Outremont.
Speaker, last year the federal court ruled that withholding health care from refugees was, quote, cruel and unusual, and it ordered the federal government to reinstate the federal health program. During the campaign, the Liberals promised to fully restore health care for all refugees. But yesterday, we learned that the Liberal government is restoring federal health benefits for refugees from only one country. Ignoring the courts is not real change. It's what we had before the election. Why is the Liberal leader picking and choosing which vulnerable people can get help?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
The Liberal Party of Canada committed to restoring health funding for refugees. We will be doing exactly that.
The Honourable Member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear in the House today that the Prime Minister is really excited about quaffing champagne and nibbling on canapes in the White House. But here's what he has to say about terrorism. He has an aversion to talking about terrorism, talking to Canadians about the reality of terrorism. He said in this very House, what we will not do is continue to try to talk about it and give ISIS any free publicity. Meanwhile, our American allies, our French allies, our British allies have no problem calling out ISIS. Why are the Liberals sitting quietly by while our allies take on the burden alone?
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
The question, Mr. Speaker, is why my honourable colleague is distorting the policy of the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada is very proud of what our men and women in uniform are doing. They are courageous, and they are requested by our allies in order to strengthen our contribution in the coalition. We'll do it in an effective way, in an efficient way, in an optimal way, courageously, as Canada is always doing.
The Honourable Member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Monsieur le Président, nous n'avons toujours pas de plan des libéraux sur notre mission contre l'État islamique. Les Canadiens appuient ce combat. Ils méritent de savoir pourquoi nous nous tournons notre dos. Nos alliés méritent un partenaire, celui qui ne fait pas tout à fait la lutte. Cela n'a jamais été la façon canadienne. Quel est le plan?
Honorable ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Voilà une question plus raisonnable, Monsieur le Président. C'est le rôle de l'opposition de demander au gouvernement quand sortira le plan. Eh bien, le plan viendra, Monsieur le Président, et entre-temps, le plan de l'ancien gouvernement est encore en place. Il n'y aura pas de vacuum entre les deux plans. Nous travaillons avec nos alliés. Ça serait facile d'improviser un plan sur le coin d'une table, mais nous travaillons avec nos alliés afin d'avoir un plan qui fasse en sorte que le Canada renforce le rôle de la coalition et ait une contribution optimale et complémentaire. Voilà, Monsieur le Président.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, as you see, there's no plan. When the Prime Minister announced that he would pull Canada's fighter jets out of the combat mission against the jihadist death cult ISIS, there was only two groups that were celebrating that Canada was going to back down: the Liberals and ISIS. Canada should be standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies in this fight. The brave men and women of the Canadian Forces are always willing and able to do the heavy lifting. We must do our part in the fight against ISIS. Why does the Prime Minister want to cut and run from stopping ISIS?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, Canada and our allies have stood shoulder to shoulder, and I have stood shoulder to shoulder in combat with our allies. And that's exactly the way I'm going to be planning the next process moving forward, making sure that we have an appropriate plan. I'm going to take the time to make sure that we get this right and take the fight to ISIS. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
They aren't proposing, Mr. Speaker, that they are going to take the fight to ISIS. They're bringing home and withdrawing from the combat mission. It was just over a year ago that we lost 2 members of our Canadian Armed Forces to attacks carried out by ISIS-inspired terrorists right here in Canada. Over the last few weeks, we witnessed ISIS-orchestrated terrorist attacks in Lebanon, in Egypt, in France, and now the United States. Clearly, ISIS is willing to bring the fight to us. Why won't the Prime Minister take the fight to ISIS? Why does he want to retreat?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the member opposite brought this important issue up in terms of the threats to our country. And this is something we need to take very seriously, but we also need to make sure that we identify the right indicators, that we can identify the right threats. When it comes to radicalization, it's a completely different fight. Yes, we need to fight them in their territory, but we also need to be mindful of making sure that we have the right tools to prevent radicalization of our own Canadians in this type of fight. Thank you.
Honorable député de Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, après des attentats meurtriers aux 4 coins de la planète, l'État islamique a toujours le Canada dans sa mire.
Le gouvernement doit assurer la sécurité des Canadiens tout en respectant ses engagements envers ses alliés. Retirer nos CF-18 d'Irak et de Syrie envoie le message que le Canada ne prend pas cette menace au sérieux et, au pire, que nous sommes incapables de le faire. Monsieur le Président, pourquoi le premier ministre abandonne le combat contre l'État islamique au lieu de combattre aux côtés de nos alliés?
Honorable ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Monsieur le Président, ce à quoi nous faisons face n'est pas une guerre entre religions, ce n'est pas une guerre entre civilisations, c'est le conflit entre la civilisation humaine et le terrorisme. Le Canada fera sa part courageusement en Irak et partout, et le fera de façon optimale en alliance avec ses alliés de la coalition.
Bravo, bravo. Honorable député de Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, alors que la coalition internationale intensifie les bombardements contre l'État islamique en Irak et en Syrie, le premier ministre s'obstine à retirer nos CF-18. Et ça, Monsieur le Président, malgré l'appel de la coalition internationale. Qu'est-ce que ça va prendre pour que le premier ministre se lève enfin et accepte de défendre les valeurs canadiennes aux côtés de nos alliés?
Bravo. Honorable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to airstrikes, it's one tool in terms of in toolbox in taking the fight to ISIS. We need to make sure that we look at all the capabilities when we assess the situation here. Because if we don't, and if we just come up with a knee-jerk reaction plan, we will not be affected. And I want to make sure, as a Minister of National Defence, when we propose the right option, it's going to be effective and take the fight to ISIS like we want to. Thank you.
Honourable member for Desnethie, Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, the government has promised to implement all 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That includes Recommendation 29 to conclude all outstanding claims from residential school survivors through negotiation. Canada must stop forcing survivors into a painful and adversarial court process, like the one taking place in Labrador. Will the minister commit to keeping her promise and resolving all outstanding claims through negotiation?
The Minister of Indigenous Affairs.
I thank the member for the question, and I do believe that the courts are not the right place to deal with so many of these issues that are so painful for the survivors, and I endeavour to work with the Minister of Justice to figure out how we can get these things out of the courtroom and back to the negotiating table.
Bravo.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the sentiment, but reconciliation can't just be words. So I'm going to ask my question to the Minister of Justice. Just last week, her lawyers were lambasted in the Newfoundland Supreme Court for their unconscionable behaviour in resisting the rights of the survivors of the Newfoundland and Labrador residential schools, just as they obstructed the rights of the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School. So will this minister personally intervene? Will she tell her lawyers to stand down and end this culture of obstruction that has denied the rights of these survivors of such these brutal institutions? Do the right thing.
Hear, hear. Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for the question and the statement, and certainly recognize and respect the conversations that we've had on this issue. Our government is committed to establishing a nation-to-nation relationship that respects an approach that will lay the framework for true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I am talking with my colleague and others on this issue, and we will chart a path forward that actually respects the relationship that we are going to pursue with Indigenous peoples. So thank you.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, all Canadians will soon be welcoming Syrian refugees, but they also want the assurances that proper security screening is taking place. Can the Minister of Public Safety guarantee to this House that each and every Syrian refugee will get a full, comprehensive security screening that is also signed off by the RCMP, Intelligence and Border Services?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the RCMP and CSIS and CBSA all indicated together collectively that they were fully satisfied with the security procedures that had been put in place with respect to the Syrian refugees. Indeed, they helped design them.
Honourable Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this week in the House, the minister talked about biometrics as one of the layers of security screening, but comparing fingerprints to a Canadian database, Mr. Speaker, is meaningless. Without previous records, biometrics cannot be used to identify people. Can the minister admit that biometrics are not part of security screening, but a smokescreen to give Canadians the assurance that security is taking place as they're actually rushing their plan through?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, we have made clear from the very beginning that there will be no compromise in the security procedures, that they will adhere to the highest Canadian standards. That includes the selection of the individuals who will be considered for possible refugees to Canada. It'll be included in the interviews that are done, extensive interviews by trained professionals. It's done in other ways like biometrics, and in other ways like checking against computer records, and in other ways like constant and repeated identification examinations. Every step in the way will make sure that the result is satisfactory and Canadians can be proud of what we've accomplished.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, our party supports Canada doing its part to assist with the Syrian refugee crisis, be it through humanitarian aid, the international mission to contain the so-called Islamic State, and welcoming refugees to our country. Out of the 1,537 permanent resident visas the Minister's Department says has been granted to Syrian refugees since November the 4th, will the Minister tell us how many of their resettlement applications were started prior to October 19th of this year?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, this is a wonderful day when we welcome the first plane full of 160 new Canadians. And I learned from a 10-year-old girl when I went to visit an apartment that was being made ready for refugees how to say this in their own language. So I would teach every member of the House to say, Akalam wa sakalam fi Canada.
The member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Many of these new permanent residents to Canada will expect answers from their immigration minister. Mr. Speaker, the minister hasn't said if other citizenship and immigration service lines would be impacted by the government's arbitrary year-end target for their Syrian refugee initiative. This is troubling to many Canadians who have pressing applications in other streams. So, Mr. Speaker, have any visa officers been displaced from other duties, including processing spousal sponsorship applications, to meet the government's self-imposed timeline for the Syrian refugee initiative? And if so, how many?
Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Well, we're into sunny ways. I would suggest my colleague look a little more cheerful. But in answer to her question, and I will give an answer, I can assure her that my department has assured me that no people have been displaced from other refugees. There will be no impact on their entry.
Order. Order. I encourage members to try not to be provocative in this place and to show respect for each other on all sides. On all sides. Honourable Member for Saskatoon West. Excuse me.
During the election, the Prime Minister promised to restore home mail delivery. That means he would reverse the cuts. But now the Minister of Public Works says people who lost home delivery won't get it back. They'll be stuck with super boxes. The government is turning their back on 850,000 Canadians who lost door-to-door service. Why did the Prime Minister promise to restore home delivery if that's not what his government plans to do?
The Honourable Minister of Public Services.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable member for her question. What we committed to do was to do away with the installation of roadside mailboxes, and that happened. We've also committed to a comprehensive review consulting Canadians from coast to coast to coast about the future of Canada Post.
Honorable député de Jonquière.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Promettre une chose et faire ce contraire ne fait qu'alimenter le cynisme. En campagne, le Premier ministre a été clair. Un gouvernement libéral devrait rétablir la livraison du courrier à domicile. Maintenant, ils promettent des consultations. Wow! Tout ça ressemble à une stratégie pour cacher le fait qu'ils reculent sur leur engagement. La question est simple. Est-ce que la ministre peut confirmer que son gouvernement n'a plus l'intention de rétablir le service du courrier à domicile?
The Minister of Public Services.
Mr. Speaker, we did what we said we were going to do. We put a stop to the installation of roadside mailboxes so that Canadians could continue to receive door-to-door where the mailboxes weren't installed. We've also committed to a review of Canada Post, and we're going to do that so Canadians can have their say.
Right. Now the member for Surrey Newton.
Mr. Speaker, Surrey, and in particular my riding of Surrey Newton, is facing a violent crime situation day in, day out, and residents are very concerned. In April of 2015, the City of Surrey requested 100 new RCMP officers to combat this problem. Can the Minister of Public Safety please update the House on the progress of putting those 100 new police RCMP officers into action?
Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for that question and for his tremendous efforts to ensure that his constituents have the police services that they require. I'm pleased to inform the House that 75 of the 100 officers that were requested have actually arrived now in Surrey, and an additional 10 officers will be arriving very shortly. The RCMP expect the remaining 15, to be assigned by spring ahead of the deadline in April.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Lorsqu'un gouvernement respecte et veut changer notre démocratie, il consulte la population. Plusieurs gouvernements provinciaux l'ont fait, l'Ontario, la Colombie-Britannique, l'île du Prince-Édouard. Or, en octobre dernier, seulement 27% des électeurs canadiens ont voté pour le Parti libéral. Monsieur le Président, qu'est-ce que ça prend pour ce gouvernement libéral qu'il comprenne qu'on ne change pas les règles fondamentales de notre démocratie qui remontent à la Confédération, Monsieur le Président, sans consulter toute la population?
Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, I can appreciate the members opposite newfound passion for public consultations. Allow me to reiterate, in the months ahead, Canadians will have an ongoing conversation about electoral reform, a conversation that will answer many questions, not just one. Now, I can appreciate that the party opposite may be uncomfortable with hearing a diverse range of views, but we are not.
Yeah. Member for Ronald Frontenac Kingston.
I'm reliably informed that nothing is more diverse than the views expressed in a referendum. Mr. Speaker, in 2007, Ontario's Liberal government consulted Ontarians in a referendum on electoral reform. It lost 37% to 63%, but the Liberal minister who administered that referendum still thinks it was the right thing to do. Back in June, she took issue with the Prime Minister's undemocratic approach and said, if you're going to totally change the electoral system, I think it could have to be a referendum. But what's the lesson this Prime Minister has drawn from 2007? It is, don't ask Canadians because they might not approve the system that his minions are designing. Provincial Liberals don't fear a referendum. Why does this Prime Minister fear it?
Now the Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, allow me to try this way. As part of a national engagement process, we will ensure that electoral reform measures such as ranked ballot, proportional representation, mandatory voting, and online voting are fully and fairly studied and considered. And as part of that process, we are absolutely committed to ensuring that Canadians from coast to coast to coast are heard.
The honourable member for Banff.
Mr. Speaker, she quotes from a platform that was supported by 39% of Canadians. She quotes from a platform as if that's the only reason anybody voted Liberal. Maybe she believes that. But Jonathan Rose, the expert who designed the electoral reform proposals that were put to Ontarians in 2007, also disagrees with the Prime Minister. He said, I think it shouldn't be a blue ribbon panel deciding this, or politicians. It should be put to a national referendum for approval. So if he's not afraid of it, the Ontario Liberals are afraid of it. Why is Justin Trudeau afraid of it?
I remind members are very spirited today, I know. We're near the end of, in December, and it's the season and all that, but let's remember that we don't use personal names here. We refer to titles and riding names and so forth. I think we have the Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, we firmly believe that a decision on an issue as important as this deserves a thoughtful and comprehensive process. We will not prejudge the outcome of this process. Early in the new year, I will work with the House Leader to convene an all-party parliamentary committee to assess all possible options and move forward.
Colleagues, let's all try. We're in the spirit, but let's all try to restrain ourselves and listen to the other person's argument, whether we like it or not. Sometimes we don't, but let's try to listen, show respect for them, but also, more importantly, for this place. The Honourable Member for Banff Airdrie.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it's quite clear the minister has made it very clear that they're doubling down, and they'll refuse to ask Canadians about fundamentally changing our electoral system. This is the method of voting that we've used since Confederation. Hear, hear. We're not talking about routine amendments here. There's 3 provinces that have all proposed fundamental change, and they all knew that it was important enough to put that question to a referendum. If the Liberal Party is so sure that they have the support of Canadians, why are they so afraid to put it to a referendum?
The Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Anyone's afraid of a referendum.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians entrusted us with a mission to restore the integrity in our electoral process, to restore fairness, and to ensure that every vote counts. We will deliver on that process, and we have committed to engaging the people of this country, young and younger at heart, in this engagement process.
Député de Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagot.
Monsieur le Président, des milliers d'enfants vont à l'école le ventre vide. Des milliers d'aînés vivent dans la pauvreté. Ce sont eux qui profiteraient d'une nouvelle allocation canadienne pour enfants ou d'une bonification du supplément de revenu garanti, des promesses de ce gouvernement. Mais quelle est la priorité du gouvernement? Réduire les impôts de ceux qui gagnent entre 90 et 200 000. Est-ce que le ministre peut nous expliquer pourquoi son gouvernement n'a-t-il pas choisi d'aider en priorité ceux qui en ont réellement besoin?
Oui. Ministre de la Famille.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie Madame la députée de sa question, qui est effectivement très pertinente. Je sais qu'elle est heureuse de constater que le nouveau gouvernement a de grandes ambitions en termes de lutte contre la pauvreté, de lutte contre l'inclusion, et je l'invite à être extrêmement attentive aux mesures qui vont être annoncées dans les prochains mois.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are giving a $700 tax break to the well-off, while 7 out of 10 Canadians get nothing. Seniors waiting for an increased pension are told to hang on. Parents who are struggling to pay for childcare are told to wait. But a banker who makes $190,000 a year gets help. Where is the urgency to help those that need it most? And why are Canadians who live in poverty not getting anything while the wealthy get another handout?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we've started this week with an important step to help Canadians. We've introduced a tax cut for the middle class. We're going to move forward in Budget 2016 with a measure that we know will take hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty and help 9 out of 10 Canadian families. That will be our Canada Child Benefit, and it will make enormous difference for the most vulnerable in this country.
Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In September, the Prime Minister indicated that he had problems with the mandatory sentences that were introduced by our Conservative government. Yes, Mr. Speaker, under our government, people who bring illegal drugs into Canada, those who kidnap and sexually exploit children, and those who produce and distribute child pornography all go to jail. Why does the Prime Minister have a problem with that?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, our Our government is committed to doing and undertake a review of the criminal justice system, including sentencing, and we will do that in a comprehensive way, engaging with our colleagues in the provinces and territories. As respects to mandatory minimums, we will also be reviewing those. Certainly with respect to mandatory minimums for the most serious of crimes, we support that, but only with respect to adherence to the Charter, and we will continue to update this House on our progress.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous Conservative government did everything in its justice legislation to protect victims and hold violent criminals accountable for their crimes. This government, on the other hand, wants to go easy on violent criminals by eliminating mandatory minimums. Mr. Speaker, why does this government insist on giving violent criminals a break?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to reviewing the criminal justice system, looking at sentencing, including mandatory minimums. We are taking an approach to the criminal justice system that focuses not only on punishing offenders, but also on restorative justice, being smart on crime.
The honourable member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government is punishing law-abiding gun owners again, bringing in a needless permit regime that would require gun owners to get a permit every single time they go hunting or go to the range. Clearly, it's a gateway to bring back the billion-dollar gun registry and make life as difficult as possible for rural Canadians. I have to ask, why do the Liberals always target law-abiding gun owners, and why not go after criminals for a change?
Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is just simply wrong in what he says about the long gun registry. We made it very clear in our platform that we have no intention of reinstating the long gun registry. We announced a number of other measures in the platform that have to do with public safety and gun safety in particular, and we will implement our platform, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable député de Gatineau.
Monsieur le Président, comme député de Gatineau, je sais à quel point notre fonction publique fédérale se distingue de par son professionnalisme. Tout comme mes collègues, j'ai personnellement rencontré des milliers de nos fonctionnaires qui attendent un gouvernement qui les respecte et qui valorise leurs contributions. Ce gouvernement s'est engagé à négocier de bonne foi avec nos fonctionnaires. Est-ce que le président du Conseil du Trésor peut informer cette Chambre sur les démarches qu'il a entreprises afin d'améliorer les relations entre le gouvernement et les fonctionnaires fédéraux?
Honorable président du Conseil du Trésor.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie le député de Gatineau. C'est une priorité pour nous de rétablir une culture de respect envers notre fonction publique. Récemment, j'ai rencontré 2000 fonctionnaires dans une assemblée. J'ai rencontré les chefs des syndicats avec lesquels j'ai parlé du rapport sur la santé mentale dans la fonction publique. Nos engagements sont clairs. On va respecter les négociations, on va négocier de bonne foi et on va rétablir une culture de respect.
The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, members of the media are telling us that they have been unable to get a hold of the Ambassador for Religious Freedom since the new government was sworn in. The Ambassador has previously been a highly effective advocate internationally, earning widespread acclaim and achieving substantial results. So at a time when religious minorities are more vulnerable than ever before, why is the Ambassador being muzzled?
Why? The Minister of Foreign Affairs.
It's quite rich from this party, Mr. Speaker. We don't muzzle officials at all. They did. They did. They did all over the place. We'll fight to protect the right of liberty and all the right of religion, freedom of religion, and all the freedoms will be protected as much as possible by this government.
The member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Well, this week, Canada is back in the Hall of Shame on climate change. First, the government showed up at the Paris negotiations with the Conservatives' weak targets. Now they're blocking agreement on compensation for the world's poorest people. This has earned Canada a Fossil of the Day award, just like the old government used to do. It's déjà vu all over again, Mr. Speaker. Quand est-ce que ce gouvernement va-t-il arrêter de bloquer les négociations et faire enfin preuve de véritable leadership en matière de changement climatique?
As a Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Monsieur le Président, c'est tout à fait le contraire. Pour la première fois depuis 10 ans, le Canada est un leader dans la lutte au changement climatique. Instead of being a lagger, we are a leader. That's the change, and we must congratulate the Minister of the Environment. She has been appointed as a facilitator by the chair of the COP21. It shows how much she's great and helping for the result that we want for the fight against climate change. Canada is back, Mr. Speaker.
Monsieur le Président, hier, nous étions fiers d'entendre le Premier ministre nous faire part des efforts déployés par le gouvernement pour installer les réfugiés syriens au Canada. Ceci témoigne de l'engagement que nous avons pris envers les Canadiens et le monde entier en réponse aux besoins urgents qui se fait sentir à l'échelle internationale. La ministre du Patrimoine canadien peut-elle dire à la Chambre quelles mesures le gouvernement compte prendre pour faciliter l'inclusion sociale des réfugiés syriens?
Honorable ministre du Patrimoine.
Merci mon collègue député de Sudbury pour la question. En fait, les organismes fédéraux et d'autres partenaires travaillent présentement avec mon ministère pour faciliter l'inclusion sociale des réfugiés syriens. D'ailleurs, nous mettrons à leur disposition dès ce soir, à leur arrivée à Toronto, une trousse de bienvenue qui inclura notamment des films, des livres en français et en anglais et qui les introduira à la diversité des cultures de notre pays, incluant la culture autochtone. Alors, nous pouvons compter sur la chaleur et l'hospitalité des Canadiens dans ce contexte de l'arrivée des nouveaux réfugiés syriens. Merci.
The member for South Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the election, the Liberals told Canadians that $10 billion a year in deficits would be paid for new infrastructure. But as we've seen, this government has already committed billions of dollars in spending, and it has also a $1.2 billion revenue shortfall from this week's tax announcement. And on top of this, there's no new infrastructure spending that has been announced. How much are they going to cut back from their infrastructure plan that was promised to Canadians?
I have the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, we committed to double our infrastructure funding over the next 10 years. That will help us create sustainable, livable, and healthy communities. And we are committed to do that.
Honorable député de Terrebonne.
Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement précédent a décidé en 2013 d'appuyer un recours visant à invalider la loi 99, loi réaffirmant le droit du Québec de disposer de son propre avenir. Je rappelle au gouvernement la motion unanime de l'Assemblée nationale du Québec qui réaffirme le droit des Québécois et Québécoises de décider eux-mêmes leur avenir politique. Le gouvernement entend-il se retirer de cette cause afin de respecter la volonté unanime de l'Assemblée nationale ou continuera-t-il à nier le droit du Québec à décider de son propre destin?
Madame la ministre des Affaires étrangères.
Monsieur le Président, aucun gouvernement indépendantiste n'aurait le droit d'enlever le Canada aux Québécois qui voudraient le garder. C'est une question de droit et une question de démocratie. Et de toute façon, les Québécois, en grande majorité, sont de très fiers Québécois et de très fiers Canadiens et ne veulent pas qu'on les oblige à choisir entre ces deux belles identités.
Bravo. Honorable député de la Pointe-l'Île.
Monsieur le Président, 3500 réfugiés haïtiens et zimbabwéens, dont ceux qui ont vécu le tremblement de terre en Haïti, sont menacés actuellement de déportation depuis juin dernier. C'est inacceptable et inhumain. Le gouvernement du Québec a fait plusieurs demandes de sursis et pour qu'ils obtiennent leur résidence permanente. Le fédéral a la capacité d'accueillir immédiatement des milliers de réfugiés. Il est donc capable d'agir. Le premier ministre s'engage-t-il dès maintenant à régulariser de manière globale et collective leur statut de résidence?
Madame la ministre de l'Immigration.
La réponse est oui, Monsieur le Président. Après des discussions avec mon collègue de Bourassa et avec la ministre québécoise de l'Immigration, j'ai décidé que mon ministère aidera ces Haïtiens de régulariser leur position au Canada et, en consultation avec mon collègue, le ministre de la Sécurité publique, nous allons donner les détails bientôt.